I was at the school summer barbecue in first grade. I didn't want to be there in the first place because obviously I had better things to do. I wasn't going to eat a hamburger or a slice of watermelon with my friends. I wanted to go play Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen on my little Game Boy. It's funny because I don't really remember where I was in the game or what I was doing, but I do distinctly remember falling in love with the reimagined Gen 1 soundtrack. Oh, also, I had a Bulbasaur, and that's about it. In 2004, Game Freak and the Pokemon Company had beyond established a standard for what to expect from upcoming releases. Main series games and spin-offs were produced and released across a handful of consoles. But for the first time ever, Nintendo posed the question, what if we reproduced a Pokemon classic using the new engine and mechanics of the modern-day games? For a lot of us, these games were our first taste of nostalgia. Let's tear up together and take a look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen, the very first remakes in the Pokemon franchise. Okay people, bad stuff first. There's not too much wrong with these games, but we're still going to try to end these videos on a good note, because what's the point in sending all of you home grumpy and sad? I wouldn't even say there's anything inherently ugly about the Gen 3 remakes. There are definitely a lot of question marks here and there, but I tend to excuse them as a learning curve since these were the very first of many remakes for years to come. At face value, I'd say the most glaring downside to FireRed and LeafGreen is the national dex on multiple levels. It produces more problems than probably necessary. First off, it's near impossible to complete, especially with the addition of event Pokemon like Deoxys and Mew. Then of course you have Jirachi, which you have to jump through hoops to get in Pokemon Coliseum, and that is deserving of its own entire video just because of how complex it is. But just about anything that isn't accessible in Kanto stays that way for most of your playthrough. You better get working on beating the game, because Gens 2 and 3 don't even become available to you until you beat the Pokemon League. Now, this begs the question, what about the wireless adapter, right? It came in the box with these games when they hit the shelves. They advertised wireless connectivity between you and your friends to trade, battle, and so much more. We were told that Pokemon from Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald could be brought into this game, and they can be, but not until you beat the main story and complete the post-game quests. At that point, I just wonder what the point is. Because now, I've basically done everything that you need to do to beat the main game. I feel like a lot of the appeal from this feature is getting to complete the game using Pokemon that you're not used to seeing in this region, but that's just not in the cards unless you use cheats. One of the popular examples of how this national dex problem affects you in the main story is in the event that you want to evolve your Golbat into a Crobat, or your Chansey into a Blissey, or really any evolution that's introduced post-Gen 1. They try to evolve, but can't until you have the national dex. So until then, every time that they level up, you'll see the evolution animation fail, unless they're of course holding an Everstone. So that's really the biggest con about these games. Other than that, the only other thing to maybe consider a downside to the games is their plot. And that's mainly because it's a remake. It's already something that we're familiar with. It's nothing to write home about. One thing leads to the next, just like the original, and your main goal is the gym challenge. I personally don't dislike it. In today's age of remakes and remasters, we're almost expecting some kind of change or twist that spices things up a little. In the Gen 1 remakes case, they spice things up in the form of the Sevii Islands. Now, I think the Sevii Islands were both good and bad. They added an extra layer of brand new content to the game that we didn't have before. The only thing is, I wish it was truly placed at the end of the game. It sort of shows up after you beat the 7th gym, and it almost fully kills your momentum going into the final gym. It's a quick little sidebar that doesn't really need to happen at that time, but it does anyways. With everything you initially have access to, you can breeze through the first few islands quests in like 30 to 45 minutes, and then resume until you beat the game and go back. So let's break down the islands real quick. First up, we have one island. Here is the Pokemon Network Center, which is run by Celio, who Bill introduces to you when you arrive at the Sevii Islands. Now, this modified version of a Pokemon Center is super integral to the very final quest of the Sevii Islands, ultimately allowing you to link Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald from your game. But that final quest doesn't become available until you've defeated the champion in the main story, which I mentioned earlier. 2 Island is where things open up a bit more. You have the Joyful Game Corner, which is run by a man who has lost his daughter, conveniently named Lostelle. You go to 3 Island to find her. There's a biker gang to take down on the way to Berry Forest, where you rescue her from a hypno. You then return her to her father, and as a reward, you get to gamble. Now, moving on to Four Island. You don't unlock this until you beat the Elite Four and register 60 different Pokemon in your Pokedex. But when you do, Bill will give you the Rainbow Pass in order to start the quest for the Ruby and Sapphire gems. This island is notable for being the home of Elite Four's Lorelei, where every 25 times you enter the Hall of Fame, a new doll will appear in her home. Cool. You of course get the second Pokemon Daycare, where you finally unlock breeding way too far into the game. Oh, you can also find the HM for Waterfall there, which I guess is cool. Moving on, we have Five Island, boasting a Team Rocket base. Wait, I thought we got rid of him. Anyways, this ties into that Ruby Sapphire quest. There's Resort Gorgeous, in case you were looking for a nice relaxing stay. But of course, not until you rescue a woman named Selfie from Lost Cave. Why is everybody getting lost? Once you return her home, she'll ask you to show you a specific species of Pokemon, and in return, she'll give you one of 10 different rewards, most of which are resellable at shops for some cash. It doesn't really intrigue me. I don't know if I'm biased just because I like more story-based stuff. I'm just not really into this. A trend that I noticed here at the Sevii Islands is that you visit these different routes, and you can catch some Gen 2 Pokemon here and there, and you can do small little tasks in exchange for TMs or items, but they're strange tasks, where the reward doesn't feel like much of a payoff. For example, Six Island has a lady who's looking for a big Heracross. She's demanding that she wants to see the ultimate horn. And if you show her the ultimate horn, she'll give you a nest ball. Now, she'll continue to do that for every Heracross you show her that beats that previous size record. This is cool, I guess, but for one nest ball, I'm not really sold on it. There's Ruin Valley and the dotted hole where you initially find the Sapphire, and then it's stolen by Team Rocket's Gideon, who you eventually chase back to that rocket hideout I mentioned before. There's Green Path, which is exactly what it sounds like, Outcast Island, and of course, the Altering Cave. And the only thing, which I think everyone knows at this point about Altering Cave, is that it's just filled with Zubat. Now, back in the days of old, Mystery Gift would allow you to alter the wild Pokemon found in this cave to be replaced by a bunch of Johto Pokemon. But outside of Japan, this never became a reality for us. Lastly, we have Seven Island, which notably boasts Trainer Tower, where trainers from all over come to battle others in the 8 floors of the tower as fast as they can. It's like the Battle Tower, but in between battles, you're allowed to heal, and the whole thing is timed. In addition to this, Seven Island has the Tenobi Ruins, where if unlocked with the Tenobi Key, you'll be able to encounter some unknown. And that's the Sevii Islands. Like I said, they added an extra layer of post-game content that normally you wouldn't have had in Pokemon Red and Blue, which I think is really cool, but for me personally, it just didn't do it. I don't really remember touching the Sevii Islands when I had this game as a kid. Now, I definitely don't have an interest in those tiny little side quests or whatever you want to call them. The campaign has no sort of expansion, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. This was their first go at a remake, and it did just that. But now, we can talk about the good stuff. You had your original 150 Pokemon plus Gens 2 and 3.
Even if you couldn't access them until the post-game.
They're all overhauled from the predecessors, complete with updated typings, natures, abilities, stats, and many more things that were not present in the original games. Held items were now available. Dark and Steel typing provided a little bit more of layering and strategy. You could now play as the female character model, which was something that had been introduced since those first games. Some other cool new features we got included the help screen, and me personally, I always popped for this little track that played right before you started a new game. You also had unique artwork for when you would enter different caves and forests, which I thought was a nice touch. You had that recap every time you booted up the game to remind you where you left off. This was a cool feature, but not necessarily something that I needed all the time, as it would get very redundant very quickly. Bugs and glitches were treated in the remakes, broken typings and moves. I'm looking at you, Psychic type. Double battles make an appearance, but you don't really see any of them throughout the game, as these are intended as mostly faithful remakes. One of my favorite things about these games, though, is that you had the remastered music. And right off the top of my head, some of the top tracks from the soundtrack that come to mind, I think of the Champion theme and how it was just all these different MIDI instruments attacking you at once, really immersing you into that final battle. I loved that the Sevii Islands included Gen 2 classics remastered with the Gen 3 sound font, and just really everything about Gen 1 soundtrack is classic. It's nothing necessarily to write home about, but it was enough to take you back. You got that familiar taste of the horns and the pianos from Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald coming together to remind you of a much simpler time in Gen 1. The wireless adapter was a revolutionary concept, and it allowed you to trade between your games, which is a very cool addition. Wrapping it up, what I like most about this is that it's just simple. It's very straightforward, like the originals. To me, less is more in that sense. Now, there's a very specific camp of people that tend to hate on remakes. Some see it as lazy, or some see it as a safer option, or some see it as a cash grabber, whatever you want to call it. While that may be true, I can't really blame them for capitalizing on what they know will get them the big bucks, which, in this case, is nostalgia. And like I said, that was our first true taste of nostalgia as Pokemon fans. And as fans of everyday media, it was something that never really had been touched upon in games before. I think this was a huge step forward in terms of preserving vintage media. Hell, this game might as well be considered vintage at this point. It's been, what, like 20 years? Look, I don't know what's vintage and what isn't, but what I do know is that these games will always be classic to me, even if some things about them piss me off. I'm a Pokemon fan through and through, and I've stated that before, and this game was really fun to revisit. I never really dived deep into the games like this, so in the process, I learned more than I thought I knew about the games, or even re-jog my memory and remind myself of little tweaks or features here and there that I didn't remember before. So thank you for taking this journey with me. If you stuck through till the end, please like and subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts on FireRed and LeafGreen. Maybe a favorite memory with the games, something you like about them, something you dislike about them, because I'd love to get the conversation going like we did with the Scarlet and Violet video. Lastly, be sure to stay tuned, because I'll have a couple more videos coming out about these games, and you're definitely not gonna want to miss them. But until next time, thank you for making me a part of your day. Peace!